In the year 1946, from May 2nd to May 4th, one of the bloodiest escapes in history was attempted at the prison nicknamed Alcatraz. One of the 6 escapees had purposefully starved himself and is able to squeeze through the bars to give him access to a gun gallery. Now armed, the prisoners force guards to open up the isolation cells. What ensues is the Battle of Alcatraz, a furious fight that ends with 2 officers dead and 14 officers wounded. 3 prisoners are also killed, and 2 are later executed for their participation in the battle. What could have driven men to become so desperate and so violent? This is what we'll try to figure out today. That wasn't the first escape attempt from the prison that even the most hardened criminals feared, and it wouldn't be the last, in spite of the fact that trying to get out of Alcatraz was an extremely deadly ambition. Even if the prisoners did get to the beaches surrounding the fortress of Alcatraz, there was every chance that their dead bodies would end up being scooped out of the frigid waters sometime later. First, we'll come back to these insane escape attempts and perhaps one that was successful. But first, we need to ask ourselves this. If trying to escape statistically gave the prisoner a good chance of being shot or designated missing and presumed drowned, why did they keep trying? What was so bad about Alcatraz? Long before this place was called the end of the line for difficult criminals, it was used as an army barracks and then a military prison. In 1934, it became the property of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, with the authorities hoping it could contain some of the most vicious and difficult criminals in the USA. From 1920 to 1933, the country had experienced a devastating rise in crime because of a harebrained thing called the Prohibition, with crime rates going up in 30 major U.S. cities by 24%. This war on one of the most popular drugs wreaked havoc on society. And then, if things weren't already bad enough, starting in 1929 and lasting for a decade was the Great Depression. It was a bad time to be an American if you came from one of those places they called the other side of the tracks. So this was the climate when Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary first opened its doors to who the authorities said was the worst of the worst, the criminals that were almost beyond rehabilitation. These were the folks that were labeled the incorrigibles. If you were a criminal back then and deemed a menace to the prison where you were already incarcerated, one day you could have been knocked up early in the morning and told you were getting a transfer. After that, you'd been taken to a specially designed train coach where you were shackled and handcuffed with a bunch of other prisoners, not to mention surrounded by around 60 FBI agents and U.S. Marshals. All you would have known is that this was big. Something big was happening, but you'd have no idea you were being taken to a hellhole like no other. At a place called Tiburon, just north of San Francisco, you'd have been taken by barge to San Francisco Bay. Never in your life would you have seen so many armed guards, although almost every prisoner with you has a solid reputation as being what the authorities called an agitator. It's at the Bay that you catch your first glimpse of the warden and his assistants, who, due to their stern reputations and dogged toughness, have been nicknamed Iron Men. Once on the island, these men march you and the others single file to where you're stripped and searched, after which you're given a number and told which cell block you're going to. For you, cell block B, although at some point during your stay you'll likely end up in cell block D, the dreaded isolation block. You walk into your cell and feel a sense of dread, measuring 5 feet by 9 feet and fitted out with 1 steel bed and 1 steel shelf. Your entire worldly possessions amount to a toothbrush, some tooth powder, 2 towels, and a cup. What's strange is the silence, a very eerie silence. You've been told not to speak, but it's just strange that no one is. The last prison was nothing like this. Things become a bit clearer when you read the book that's been given to you entitled Regulations for Inmates USP Alcatraz. Inside, you read that your life won't be hard with a good conduct record and a good work record. In Section 5, it says you are entitled to food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. Anything else that you get is a privilege. And let's just say they are deadly serious when it comes to taking your privileges away, which is one reason why people will soon be literally dying to get off that rock of Alcatraz. You'll learn that you might be working hard, and anything that gets in the way of that is a very serious offense. In fact, many things seem to constitute a serious offense, from mere loitering to loaning things out, especially gambling or talking back to the guards. The book explains that the morning bell goes off at 7 a.m., after which you will get ready and be standing by your cell door facing outward at 7:20 a.m. No noise is permitted, not even a whisper, and don't you dare look to your side once you're out of the cell. You will walk to the dining hall in single file, you cannot chat with the other prisoners, and you should not switch your place in line. Do not, it says, indulge in horseplay. Damn, you think, are they serious about this? Then you read in capital letters, you may be stopped and searched at any time, do not attempt to carry contraband. But things get a bit better, at least if you don't break the rules. There is a movie day twice a month, and if you're especially good, you might be allowed to play sports in the yard. At least after you finish your 30-day quarantine period, when you arrive at Alcatraz. Just get your work done 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, keep your cell clean, don't talk when you're not supposed to, and you'll get some of those privileges. So far, Alcatraz just sounds like a really strict prison, but some of the things we just mentioned drove some of those prisoners half mad, and sometimes seriously medically mad. They really weren't supposed to talk in their cells ever, or at least when one warden was in charge. That total silence was deafening, and if anyone was caught trying to whisper a message to another prisoner, they could end up losing their privileges or even take a trip to D-Block, the home of the notorious Hole. The only time they could talk, except from when they were out in the yard, was when they were eating, and this living half their life in silence was not easy at all. The good news is the food was pretty good, with one of the wardens saying if a prisoner gets the right food, he'll be much more useful at work and less prone to acting out. This was on the menu for one Alcatraz breakfast: oatmeal, milk, sausage, fried potatoes, toast, and coffee. For dinner, they got bean soup, roast beef, and veg. For supper, they got pork and beans, salad, spiced apples, and more coffee and bread. The prisoners got some recreation time in the yard on weekdays, although just a few minutes. On Saturdays and Sundays, they got a good chunk of the morning in the yard and a couple hours in the afternoon. It was the same with public holidays. On top of that, many prisoners who didn't break the rules got to use the public library, with the average Alcatraz prisoner getting through 70 to 100 books a year from a stockpile of 10,000 to 15,000. So it wasn't all bad news getting sent to Alcatraz. 1 year after the prison opened its doors to around 240 prisoners, the Bureau of Prisons issued a report stating, "The establishment of this institution not only provided a secure place for the detention of the more difficult type of criminal, but has had a good effect upon discipline in our other penitentiaries also. No serious disturbance of any kind has been reported during the year." Okay, so why did this place become known as Alcatraz? That's what you want to know. Well, first of all, there was what the Bureau of Prisons was saying and what the prisoners said. The writer of that report we just mentioned there must have decided to skip the guard brutality part of life in Alcatraz. As you know, if prisoners towed the line, they were paid back in privileges. But you haven't heard about what happened when someone didn't toe the line. If you think breaking the rules wasn't easy to do, just imagine having to stay silent for hours on end. Imagine staying silent when a guard has his knees in your back and another is pummeling you over the head. Imagine trying not to speak when some dude is trying to extort you. Or just imagine keeping quiet when you just need to hear a voice when you're at your lowest depth and there's a guy next door to you. So, soon after it was opened, critics of Alcatraz were saying this was a project that just couldn't work. One of them called the place a great garbage can of San Francisco Bay, into which every federal prison dumped its most rotten apples. He, like the others, said when you dump a lot of desperate and broken men into one place, something sinister will start to happen. Alcatraz, they said, is a pressure cooker, a human time bomb. Even though the population was usually only 260 to 275 people, and it rarely went above 300, you have to remember that this 1% of the entire US prison population at the time was often a violent bunch. The way to fix this, according to the authorities, was stricter measures, but these were men like Cool Hand Luke, in that you just couldn't reach them. One of them was Robert Stroud, aka the Birdman of Alcatraz. Prior to arriving in Alcatraz, he'd murdered a prisoner in another prison and later killed a guard. This guy spent 54 years in prisons in total, 42 of which were in solitary confinement. In prison, he taught himself a lot about birds and actually became a fairly well-respected ornithologist, although he didn't actually keep birds in Alcatraz. In his former prison, he wrote the book Diseases of Canaries. But now in Alcatraz, and because of his violence, it was decided the way to rehabilitate him would be to deprive him of the things he most treasured. This was the Alcatraz way, and there's a good argument to suggest that it does not work. Stroud had run away from home at the age of 13 to escape a very violent father. He was obviously traumatized, and it was in prison where he seemed to get even more violent, so the authorities deemed him one of those incorrigibles. He was no doubt a dangerous prisoner, but you have to ask if the treatment he got at Alcatraz was a good thing. The man, who was later called a brilliant self-taught expert on birds and possibly the best-known example of self-improvement and rehabilitation in the US prison system, all that stopped at Alcatraz. Instead, he was called a psychopath and kept well away from birds. The silence was deafening in the normal cells. The isolation block was like living in outer space. There were 36 segregation cells as well as solitary confinement cells. These were called the Hole. Here, prisoners often spent a grand total of 24 hours a day locked up, sometimes in the dark. Yeah, not even 1 hour out on most days. But they at least were taken to the yard at some point in the week. When that happened, the only other people in the yard were the guards. If they were following orders not to make chit-chat with the prisoner, that man never really got to talk to anyone. This is how you make men insane, which doesn't sound like rehabilitation or such a good thing for when some prisoners are released back into the public sphere. While in the Hole, they didn't receive visits from the outside. Unlike prisoners in other blocks that got one visit per month if the warden granted them one, Even then, the prisoners and the visitors weren't allowed to touch each other and were not supposed to talk about current events or life in the prison. The former prisoner, Jim Quillen, has written about Alcatraz in The Hole, and he didn't have much good to say about either. He was sent to Alcatraz in 1942 after not exactly being a model prisoner at San Quentin. In his book Inside Alcatraz, he explains the reason why people were sent there, saying, "Rehabilitation was not part of the Alcatraz vocabulary or even considered. The institution was there for the purpose of proving to unruly prisoners that they had reached the ultimate termination of their undisciplined way of life." On the day he arrived, he was greeted by a straw mattress and a dirty pillow. He couldn't believe how quiet it was, but did say he kept hearing whispers of the word fish. Apparently, prisoners were excited that some fish had come into the prison. On that first night, he wasn't undressed and in bed as fast as he could have been. The guard walked up to his cell and said, "Get undressed right now or you'll be able to see what the hole feels like." In the end, Quillen did spend time in the hole. That consisted of 24 hours a day in the pitch black. Food was shoved in now and again, and aside from the sound of scurrying rats, there was total silence. This is what Quillen said he did to keep sane. "When I'd go in the hole, what I used to do is I'd tear a button off my coveralls. I'd flip it up in the air, then I'd turn around in circles, then I'd get down on my hands and knees, and then when I found the button, I'd stand up and I'd do it again." Other reports say men were sometimes beaten before they were stripped of their clothes and thrown into the cold floor. They were given no toothbrush or soap, although once a week a guard might appear to throw cold water over the prisoner. This was all designed to dehumanize the man, to make him feel like an animal. In the worst of the cells, known as the Oriental, there was a hole in the ground through which the men could pee and defecate, which gave the place a smell of sewer. They didn't poop that often anyway, seeing as the only thing they were given to eat were slices of moldy bread along with some water. It wasn't easy to stay out of the hole, never mind how good a prisoner's record was. As one former prisoner explained, men go slowly insane under the exquisite torture of restricted and undeviating routine. The wardens sometimes weren't even the biggest problem. Such was the case of a prisoner named the Rufa Percival. In the early 1900s, this man became a convicted killer. When he spent time at Arkansas State Penitentiary on the prison farm, he was handed a gun and told to shoot any inmates trying to escape from the farm. Such were the times. He apparently shot and killed a few prisoners while maiming others. This job didn't really do much for his popularity in the prison. So when he later ended up in Alcatraz, you could say he didn't have the best of reputations among the prisoners. What's strange is that even with all those strict rules, it's said that other prisoners had many opportunities to bully Percival to the extreme. This is no doubt happening most of the time in the yard. Not only that, but the conditions of Alcatraz had a profound effect on Percival's mental well-being. He was beaten senseless whenever prisoners got close to him, and so the prison decided the best thing for him was to stay in the confinement cells. This made him the most guarded prisoner in Alcatraz. Then in 1936, he wrote a letter to James A. Johnston, the prison warden, and asked for a transfer. This was not forthcoming, and Percival was told he'd be staying in his solitary hell. No sooner than he got out of solitary, he managed to get his hands on a prison axe, which he used to cut off his fingers, apparently grinning like a madman as he did so. When he was finally diagnosed as being partially insane after complaining of seeing an alligator in his cell, but then, after again being bullied and beaten badly at the prison, he was transferred. He later actually requested to be sent back to the hole at Alcatraz after getting beaten up in his new prison. As the story goes, he was beaten for the rest of his stay, but he was never arrested for committing a crime again after he got out. He died an old man in 1991. His story just goes to show how Alcatraz was designed not to rehabilitate but to break. Now we need to talk about a convicted killer and a bank robber named Henry Young. He was a violent man, becoming known as a bank robber who was quick to use extreme violence on hostages. He also became one of the biggest names that ever went through the doors at Alcatraz. There's a movie centered around him called Murder in the First, although the depiction of Young being a nice, non-violent guy is certainly not true in the slightest. Some things are true, though, such as this. On January 3, 1939, Young and 4 other prisoners named Arthur Barker, Rufus McCain, Dale Stamphill, and William Martin tried to escape. It didn't go too well for the criminal quintet, and Barker and Stamphill lost their lives after being shot. The movie also correctly depicts Young stabbing McCain less than a year later, causing an injury that proved to be fatal. He never said exactly why he did it, but his attorneys tried to fight his case by saying his time in solitary confinement had driven him to the edge of madness. Alcatraz found itself on trial. Young described his time in the hole, a period of months, not years, as the movie says. He wrote, "You are stripped nude and pushed into the cell. There's no soap, no tobacco, no toothbrush. You have no shoes, no bed, no mattress, nothing but the 4 damp walls and 2 blankets. The walls are painted black. Once a day, I got 3 slices of bread. No, that's an error. Some days I got 4 slices." This wasn't a good look for the authorities, although